Ready to rethink what leadership really means.
Let's do it.
We're diving deep into Triangelity's new leadership principles.
And they are new. New and insightful. A breath of fresh air, honestly.
Not your grandma's leadership advice, that's for sure.
Definitely not.
So, what's the mission here? What's Triangility trying to do with these principles?
Well, it's not about tossing out all the old leadership wisdom.
Okay, so no need to burn our business books just yet.
Exactly. Think of it more like Triangility is giving us this, this updated map.
I'm at that.
Yeah, like a field guide to navigate this, well, frankly, kind of crazy complex world we're leading in.
Makes sense. So where do we even begin?
Well, they start with the foundation, the leader's mental model. Principle number 1, right out of the gate, they're saying that old my way or the highway style.
Yeah, the black and white thinking.
Exactly. It's just not cutting it anymore.
Because the real world doesn't work that way.
Right. You can't just force fit every problem into a neat little box.
So what are they proposing instead?
Leaders need to get comfortable with what they call cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance sounds a bit intimidating.
It's simpler than it sounds. It just means being okay with holding two ideas in mind, even if they seem contradictory.
So like embracing the gray areas.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Often, that discomfort, that tension of holding those opposing ideas, that's where the real breakthroughs happen.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you're wrestling with a tough decision. Maybe it's about investing in a new technology. Half your team is gung-ho, the other half is totally against it.
Been there.
Right, so a leader stuck in that old either-or mindset, they might rush to a decision just to end the debate.
Or just side with whoever shouts the loudest.
Right. But a leader who can embrace that cognitive dissonance, they'll slow down, they'll explore both sides, maybe even find a third way, a creative solution that blends the best of both.
So it's about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Exactly. Because that discomfort is a sign you're onto something. And, that leads right into another big principle, authenticity.
Oh, I knew you were going to say authenticity. It's like the leadership buzzword of the century.
It's everywhere,
yeah.
Right. But Triangility warns against what they call calculated authenticity.
I know exactly what you mean, like when it feels more performative than genuine.
Yes. And their second principle, the behavioral model, dives right into that kind of fake authenticity. It just erodes trust.
So how do you create real authenticity, the kind that actually resonates?
It comes down to vulnerability, bringing your whole self to work, warts and all, which is their principle, #3 on identity.
Wait, so you're saying we should bring our baggage to work?
In a way, yes. We all have insecurities, biases, you name it. Triangility calls it our toxic baggage.
Toxic baggage, that's a new one.
But here's the thing. Acknowledging those less than perfect parts of ourselves, it actually makes us better leaders.
Okay, now you're going to have to explain that one.
Because it allows us to connect with our teams on a deeper, more human level. When you, as a leader, are willing to be vulnerable, to admit you don't have all the answers, it gives others permission to do the same.
It creates a space for honesty.
Precisely. And that honesty, that vulnerability, it's the foundation of trust, which is essential for Triangility's next principle, empowerment.
Ah, empowerment, music to every team's ears. But we're not just talking about delegating tasks here, are we?
Nope. Triangility takes it a step further, encouraging leaders to create systems for distributed decision-making.
So less top-down control, more shared responsibility.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. They actually suggest temporarily reducing some freedoms in the process.
Wait a minute, hold on. Reducing freedoms. How does that lead to empowerment?
It's not about being controlling. It's more like providing guardrails, especially when someone is still learning the ropes.
Ah, so it's about striking that balance between giving people autonomy, but also making sure they don't veer too far off track.
Precisely. It's about finding that sweet spot between guidance and freedom.
Makes sense. So we've covered cognitive dissonance, authenticity, empowerment. What's next on Triangility's list?
Well, they tackled another buzzword you're probably tired of hearing, mindfulness.
Okay, mindfulness, but we're not talking about meditation cushions and incense, are we? What does mindfulness look like for a leader?
It's not just about finding your zen. It's about being aware of how your internal state, your emotions, your energy, impacts your team, your decisions, the whole organization.
So if having a bad day, it's better to acknowledge it than pretend everything's fine.
Exactly. Now, I'm not saying you should unload all your emotional baggage on your team, but simply acknowledging, hey, I'm feeling a bit stressed today, bear with me.
That vulnerability thing again.
Exactly. It's about building what they call humane connections, which leads perfectly into their next principle,
Right.
relationships. Triangulity argues that we need to move away from purely transactional, role-based interactions at work.
Towards something more meaningful.
Right. Recognizing that we're all human beings with lives and emotions outside of our job titles.
So how do we create that kind of environment where people feel seen and valued for who they are?
It starts with leaders creating safe spaces for vulnerability.
Safe spaces, what does that look like in practice?
It's about fostering a culture where people feel comfortable sharing their ideas, their concerns, even their struggles, without fear of judgment.
Where they can be themselves, put their whole selves to work, like we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And that brings us to a principle that I think resonates with a lot of people, diversity.
Diversity. Another one of those buzzwords that gets thrown around a lot, but often feels more like a box to check than a genuine value.
I agree, but Triangility's take on diversity is different. They acknowledge that while diversity is essential for long-term success, it can also be, well, messy.
Messy how? I thought the whole point of diversity was to bring in fresh perspective, make teams more creative.
It does. But navigating those different viewpoints, those different lived experiences, it takes effort.
You're saying it's not always smooth sailing?
Exactly. In fact, Triangility points out that diversity can sometimes slow things down initially.
So it's an investment.
Exactly. Think about it. If you've got a team with people from all different backgrounds, they're not always going to agree right away.
But those disagreements, those frictions, that's often where the magic happens.
Precisely. It's the leader's job to create a space where those diverse voices can be heard, where those disagreements can be productive rather than destructive.
Sounds like it takes a lot of skill and patience.
It does. And this actually circles back to that idea of cognitive dissonance we talked about earlier.
Ah, I see the connection.
Leaders who can hold multiple perspectives, even conflicting ones, they're better equipped to navigate the complexities of a diverse team.
Because they're not afraid of a little healthy debate.
Exactly. It's not about forcing everyone to agree. It's about creating a culture where those differences are valued and leveraged for innovation.
Love that. So, embracing diversity isn't just about hitting a quota. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels heard and respected, even when they disagree.
Precisely. And that brings us to principle #8, which focuses on people development. And Triangility really flips the script on how we think about people development.
Right. It's not just about climbing that ladder, the whole career ladder thing or those yearly performance reviews.
It's so much bigger than that. Principle #8 encourages a total mind shift. They want us to move away from that old human resources mentality.
Human resources. Yeah, it does sound kind of impersonal, doesn't it?
It does. And instead, they want us to embrace this idea of the resourceful human.
Okay, now that's a phrase I can get behind. Resourceful human, I love it. But what does that actually look like day to day? How do you actually do that?
So picture this. Instead of handing someone a predefined career path, you actually sit down with them and you really listen. What are they passionate about? What skills are they dying to learn?
It's about their individual growth, not just filling a slot in the company.
Yes. And then you work together to create opportunities for them to grow in a way that benefits both them and the organization.
It's win-win, right?
Yeah.
You're helping them reach their full potential, and they're more likely to be engaged, productive.
Exactly. And when people are doing work that lights them up, that plays to their strengths, that's where Triangility's next principle comes in. Motivation.
Because who hasn't had one of those soul-crushing jobs where you just feel like a cog in the machine?
The worst. Principle #9 gets at that. It says true motivation, the kind that lasts, comes from aligning people with work that really speaks to them.
It's like finding that sweet spot where their passion and their skills and the needs of the organization all line up, right?
You got it. And it's not just about individual fulfillment either. That sense of purpose, of being aligned with work that matters, it can fuel a whole organization's transformation.
Speaking of transformation, Triangility challenges us to rethink how we see organizations in the first place.
This is where they really shake things up.
Right. They want us to stop seeing organizations as these rigid, well-oiled machines.
Which so many of them are, let's be honest.
True, but Triangility is like, nope. Think of them as living, breathing organisms.
It's a huge mind shift, isn't it?
It is, but what does that even mean in practical terms? How does an organization act like a living organism?
Well, think about how a living organism adapts to its environment.
It has to evolve or it dies, right? Just like businesses in today's world.
Exactly. It's constantly evolving, responding to changes, finding new ways to not just survive, but thrive.
So instead of just trying to optimize for efficiency, which, let's be honest, can make a company pretty inflexible,
We need to be more adaptable, more responsive. Just like a living organism has its own DNA, its own set of values.
organizations need to have a strong sense of purpose.
Yes. And that purpose, those values, those are what guide our growth and help us make choices even when things get tough.
It's not just about doing things right, it's about doing the right things. The things that align with our values, our purpose, even when the path ahead is uncertain.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a principle that, frankly, can be a bit scary. Creative destruction.
Okay, creative destruct. I'm not gonna lie, it does sound a little intimidating. What exactly are we talking about here?
It's about recognizing that sometimes, to truly move forward, we have to be willing to let go of things that are no longer serving us, even if those things were once successful.
Even if they're familiar and comfortable, even if we built them ourselves, we might need to dismantle them to make space for new growth.
It's like pruning a tree, right?
Exactly. Triangulity calls this partial creative destruction. It doesn't mean blowing everything up and starting from scratch.
It's more about being honest about what's working and what's not, and having the courage to make changes, even if it's hard.
It can be really tough, especially if you've poured your heart and soul into building something. Letting go is never easy.
But sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? Or maybe that's not the best metaphor.
But you get the idea. Clinging to outdated systems, to the way we've always done things, it can really stifle innovation. So how do we embrace this idea of creative destruction? How do we know what to let go of and when? What's the key?
It takes courage, for sure,
Uh,
but it also takes vision. You have to be able to envision a different future, a better future, and then be bold enough to take those steps, even if they're uncomfortable, to make that vision a reality.
I love that. So we've got to be brave enough to let go of the old to make room for the new. And speaking of new ways of doing things, Triangility's next principle challenges that traditional top-down leadership model.
The old command and control approach,
Yeah.
yeah, they're not fans.
So what's the alternative?
Principle, hashtag 12, they call for purpose-driven networks. It's about moving away from rigid hierarchies and those, 5-year plans that are out of date a year later, and instead empowering people to self-organize, to collaborate in a more fluid, agile way.
So less about barking orders from the corner office and more about creating a shared vision that everyone can get behind.
Exactly. Because when everyone understands the why, when they're aligned around a common purpose, they're able to make better decisions, adapt more quickly to changing circumstances.
It's like everyone becomes a leader in their own right.
And, that naturally leads into another area where triangulity is challenging the status quo,
Yeah.
the workplace itself.
They basically say it's time to ditch the idea that work has to happen in a specific physical location, right?
Exactly. Principle hashtag 13. Work is not a place. It's a thing you do. It's about results, not punching a clock.
So it's about trusting people to manage their own time, their own workload, and judging them based on the value they deliver, not on how many hours they spend at a desk.
Exactly. It's about empowering people with flexibility and autonomy, which honestly in today's world is a huge motivator.
Huge. So much better than the old button seat mentality. And that brings us to another really important aspect of modern leadership: performance.
And of course, triangulity challenges the traditional view here too.
They don't just focus on the bottom line, right? It's not just about profits.
Exactly. They're advocating for what they call the triple bottom line.
Okay, love the name, but break it down for me. What exactly is the triple bottom line?
It's about measuring success, not just on financial performance, but also on our impact on people, on society, and on the planet.
So it's about considering the needs of all stakeholders, not just shareholders.
Yes. Principle, hashtag 14. Businesses have a responsibility to create value for everyone. They touch their employees, their customers, their communities, the environment, everyone.
It's a more holistic view, right? Because at the end of the day, businesses don't exist in a vacuum. Everything we do has ripple effects.
Precisely. It's about shifting from a mindset of extraction, just taking what we can get to a mindset of regeneration.
I love that. Where we're not just consuming, but contributing to a better future for everyone. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about rethinking how we develop our people, how we motivate our teams, how we even view organizations themselves.
And we're not done yet. Triangulity still has more to say about innovation.
And they have some pretty radical ideas about innovation, don't they?
Yeah, they're not afraid to shake things up. Principle #15 is all about ditching those, those isolated innovation labs.
Where all the creative types get locked away to brainstorm.
Exactly. And instead, they're pushing for this idea of embedded entrepreneurship.
Okay, I'm intrigued but also a little lost. Embedded entrepreneurship. What does that even mean?
So imagine this. What if innovation wasn't just the responsibility of, like, a small handful of people?
You're saying it becomes part of everyone's job, like from the mailroom to the boardroom.
Exactly. Imagine a company where every single person feels empowered to spot opportunities for improvement.
To experiment, to take risks.
Yes. And to speak up with their ideas without fear of being shot down.
That's amazing in theory, but it requires a certain level of trust, right?
100%. People need to feel safe, to try new things, to know that it's okay to fail, as long as they learn from it.
Which brings us right back to that foundation of psychological safety, that vulnerability we were talking about earlier.
It all connects. And that takes us to principle #16, which, maybe surprisingly, is all about technology.
Technology, I was wondering when they would get to that. So, what's Triangelity's take? Are they all about the latest gadgets and gizmos?
Not exactly. They actually flip the script on how we usually think about technology. Instead of humans bending over backward to adapt to tech.
They're saying tech should serve us, not the other way around.
Exactly. We've all been frustrated by those, those clunky software programs or those tools that are supposed to make our lives easier but just end up creating more headaches.
Ugh, don't even get me started. It's like sometimes progress moves in reverse.
All right, so principle #16, it's about being really intentional about the technology we bring into our organizations and our lives.
It's about making sure that tech is actually supporting our goals, our values, not distracting us from what matters.
And speaking of what matters, that brings us to the final principle, which really ties everything together: stakeholders.
Stakeholders. Okay, ready for the grand finale. So what's Triangelity's take?
They challenge that, that old school business mentality that companies exist solely to serve their shareholders.
The whole profit above all else thing.
Yeah, Triangility says that's way too narrow of a view. Principle #17 is all about recognizing that businesses operate within this web of relationships. We're talking employees, customers, suppliers, the community, even the planet itself.
It's about understanding that we impact and are impacted by so many people and systems beyond just the bottom line.
Exactly. They're saying that to be truly successful in the long term, businesses need to create value for all of their stakeholders.
Not just the ones who own a piece of the pie.
Exactly. And that, to me, is what these new leadership principles are all about. It's about moving away from that old extractive mindset
Where you're just trying to squeeze every last drop of profit, no matter the cost.
and embracing a more sustainable, more holistic way of leading.
One where we're considering the well-being of all stakeholders, including the planet, as we make decisions.
It's about building organizations and a world that are not just profitable, but also equitable, sustainable, and just plain better for everyone.
I love that. So we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about everything from cognitive dissonance to humane connections to creative destruction.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. And I have to say, these new leadership principles from Triangility, they're challenging, they're
It'll
thought-provoking,
make you really examine your own beliefs about leadership.
but they're also incredibly inspiring. So for our listeners out there, I'll leave you with this thought. What resonated with you most? What sparked your curiosity?
And how can you start putting these principles into action, even in small ways, in your own work and life?
It's an ongoing journey, but it's a journey worth taking.
Couldn't agree more.
And that's a wrap on another deep dive. Thanks for exploring with us. Until next time.